Just one.
Okay, well, I think we'll reward those who were on time and not punish them. So good evening and good afternoon once again. My name is Ophir Yarden, and I and Hana, as well as Adi, are from the Rossing Center. I want to welcome you all this evening, this afternoon. We are resuming our series of more or less monthly webinars. We're really pleased that you're with us this evening. And I'm going to, with no further ado, turn things over to Hana, our host for this evening's very exciting topic. Thank you, Hana.
Okay. Adi, do you want us to start or shall we wait for another minute? Okay, we can start. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, this afternoon. It's not an easy evening in Jerusalem, but it's been difficult days in the Holy Land for the last 703 days. Days of sorrow and pain and suffering and death and hatred and anger. And just today, 6 people in Jerusalem and a few dozens in the West Bank, in Gaza, added to the death toll. The war continues in Gaza, terrorism in the West Bank, suffering that continues, and we all hope and we pray that the sane voices would be loud enough to influence the decision makers to end the war, so we would be able to start a process of repair and healing. We are here today to discuss religious nationalism, and we have a very interesting context. And I want to share with you that in the last couple of weeks, I was listening to the podcast of Dr. Matthew Taylor, Charismatic Revival Theory, that described the movement of the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, from its establishment until the 6th of January, and how it influenced the 6th of January riots at the Capitol Hill. And I was thinking all the time in what way it's similar or different from the phenomena we see here in the Holy Land. When is it just people who want to connect, religious people who want to connect to tradition, to spiritualism, to God, and when it becomes something different, something that has a different kind of impact? And how can I compare these phenomena, and to what extent the religious nationalism influence our life? So I'm glad and I'm honored to help to lead a discussion between two very interesting scholars, activists, that would try to present and compare the phenomena in two different contexts. We have with us Dr. Matt Taylor, a senior Christian scholar at the Institute of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, where he specialized in American Christianity, American Islam, Christian extremism, and religious politics. His book, The Violent Take It by Force, The Christian Movement That Is Threatening Our Democracy, was published in 2024, and it tracks how a loose network of charismatic Christian leaders called the New Apostolic Reformation was a major instigating force for the January 6th insurrection and is currently reshaping the culture of the religious right in the US. And we have with us Mikhael Manekin, who's the director of the Arab Jewish Initiative, the Alliance Fellowship, developing the next generation of democratic leadership, which is part of the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. And he's a leading figure in the Faithful Left, which is a religious, social, intellectual movement working toward Judaism committed to justice, peace, and equality. And tomorrow they will have their third conference that they expect 900 people there tomorrow in Jerusalem. He previously served as the executive director of Breaking the Silence and the CEO of Molad Center, and he's the author of The Dawn of Redemption, Ethics and Redemption in the Time of Power, that was published in 2021. And he is a prominent voice advocating for Jewish identity rooted in ethics, peace, and justice. Thank you very much for being with us here this evening, this afternoon. Mikhael in Jerusalem, and Matthew in Baltimore. I would also like to thank Ophir for putting this webinar together, and Adi, who is helping us with the technology part. And I invite you to write in the chat box your name and where you're coming from. And later on, if you will have questions, you can also write them in the chat box. If you want to share it with everyone, you want to share it just with Adi or with Ophir, it's also a possibility. But I think the open discussion will be very interesting, and I'm looking forward for our discussion. And I will start with asking about the personal background and how each one of the speakers came to talk about it. So if you can, maybe Michael, you can start. How's your personal background, academic, activist, religious background shaped the way you approach the study of and engagement of religious nationalism? So Michael, if you can start, and then we can hear from Matthew.
Sure. And thanks so much for having me here. As you said, Hana, it's a rough day in Jerusalem, but happy to be here among friends and people who are interested in sort of talking. I grew up in a religious home. I also um, uh, today live in a religious, what would be called Orthodox environment. I actually want to start from the structural. I think a lot of time that's under sort of spoken, and people talk about their personal process and experience, which is of course important as well. In Israel, there are four systems of education, which are completely separate. There's a nationalist education, which is quote unquote secular. There's religious nationalist education. There's ultra-Orthodox education, which is largely private, state-funded, but privately owned. And there's Arab education. So in many senses, the question of how I deal with religious nationalism is more of a question of structure than a lot of other things. I grew up in religious nationalism and raised my children in religious nationalism. So I have, while I have thoughts, strong thoughts about the theology of religious nationalism, and for that matter, the theology of nationalism in general. And I think I hope we'll get to talk about that soon. Very quickly, we put it on religion, but obviously, it's much broader than that. I definitely am also part of that world, at least structurally, and that means a lot and is very significant in my life. So I could be a counter voice, sometimes be very frustrated, sometimes even ascribe to what would be a complete opposite sort of understanding of the world. But ultimately, the people who raise my children in school would ascribe to some form of religious nationalism, and that goes to me as well. It goes to sort of the synagogues, to a large extent, that I belong to, and so on and so forth. So I know that's a weird way to approach the question you asked, but I think it's actually sort of significant in the context of our conversation. A lot of times we talk about personal experiences, and maybe we'll get into that later, but I think it's fitting if we talk about religious nationalism to actually start sometimes with the formal and not with the personal.
And if I allow you to, if I can may ask you to go into the personal, because I think the personal makes the story more meaningful for a lot of people. So if you can take the next step and talk about the personal before we go
Sure.
to the US.
So briefly, I would say that I grew up, a lot of these movements are relatively new, which means that if you look at how your parents grew up, they're fundamentally different than how you're raised. My mother comes from what would be described as an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic background. My father grew up in a secular, conservative, or sort of loosely conservative, loosely affiliated conservative American background in Baltimore. They met in sort of various trajectories and created some sort of world in which we grew up, which I would say is very interested in engaging seriously with questions of praxis and faith, and simultaneously very left, which is a word that I'm going to prefer to use than liberal in this context. So in our context, I would say very interested and very motivated by the question of Jewish Arab equality and dignity in this land. So I was raised in a very what we would call Jewishly frum household, which means that there's a serious engagement with halakha, or praxis, or and liturgy and ritual, and simultaneously very committed to left values of equality. I'd like to hope that I raise my children in the same way as well. I'm conservative in the sense that I think that I'm very much a continuation of my parents' education. I mean, there are things which are different here and there, but I very much see what I do as a continuation of the tradition that I was raised on. I'm also aware that this is not a dominant opinion in currently in Israeli politics and Israeli thought, but I will say that in terms of the movement that I sort of belong to, the faithful left, I do think it's one of the largest growing left movements in Israel currently, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Yeah, we can get into the sociology or politics of that, but that's pretty
Maybe
much who I am.
yeah, okay, and maybe in the next session we'll talk more that of what you do and how do you
Sure.
see this nationalism here. So Matt, would you like to share with us your background and how did you ended up writing your book about the NAR and their impact on American politics? So
Yeah,
don't talk about the research, but about you and your connection to the topic, personal connection first, and then we're gonna get into the research.
yeah. Thank you for having me. Thank you for hosting me. It's an honor to be here. And by the way, Hana, you started out talking about sane voices. If you all can find any sane voices, we could use them in the United States these days too. I grew up as an evangelical Christian in California, and in the U.S., the terms evangelical and fundamentalist, at least up until 9/11, were mostly interchangeable. So we would have called ourselves fundamentalist or evangelical. Those were not necessarily in tension. Um, and then went to and speaking of structural, we don't have quite as formal of a separation of education systems, but I went to private evangelical schools, very much was raised within a kind of Christian nationalist framework. The history classes and the way that we were taught American history very much centered a kind of Christian narrative of American history. And then I went to a state university and went into Christian ministry for about a decade, and then just fell in love with academia again, and did a seminary degree, and then decided to go and do my PhD. And as I was trying to decide what to do my PhD in, really kind of fell into religious studies and especially Muslim Christian dialogue. My first book that came out in 2023 is actually about Salafi Islam in the U.S. and tracking kind of what happens to the Salafi community after 9/11 and after you have this kind of intense security gaze crashing down on the American Muslim community. And it's actually a hopeful book about pluralism and integration and some of the adaptations and shifts that have gone on within American Salafism that, as far as I can tell, are not reflected in global Salafism. It's kind of a unique case study in some ways. And I sent off the manuscript for that book to the publisher the morning of January 6, 2021. And that I thought it would be a little bit of a lighter day after I got this huge burden off my chest. And that afternoon was watching as our Capitol was stormed. And I did my PhD at Georgetown and spent a number of years in Washington, D.C. And so both having the experience of this city that I'm very familiar with, these sites that I'm very familiar with being trampled and stormed by Christians, and not just Christians, but evangelical Christians of the kind that I grew up with, was a very jarring experience for me. And I because I had just finished a book, started just trying to understand, I kind of casually and mostly out of my own interest and curiosity, what was behind this? Who were the leaders behind this? And I stumbled across this whole story that I didn't know about American evangelicalism and the shifting dynamics that are happening within the American religious right. And the center of that research is, as Hana was saying, a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. that actually I came to discover came out of the same seminary that I had attended, and the leaders of that movement, or several of them at least, had attended my seminary, even taught at my seminary, and just realized that there's been this seismic shift in the culture of the American religious right in the Trump era, and that's the story I'm trying to tell in my book. But yeah, so I sometimes say I'm a Protestant evangelical background, seminary trained, interreligious studies scholar who specializes in Islam and has a PhD from a Catholic university. So I'm a bit of bit of an interreligious mutt.
And if you already started talking about what happened on the 6th of January and how it pushed you to do a different kind of a research, not talking about the Muslims in the US, but actually this American white right. If you can talk a little bit about the social, historical, and political condition that enabled this rise of religious nationalism within the US. So can talk explain a little bit about this, the New Apostolic Reformation, and how they influenced the American politics, the American life, even. Just, to get a bit of background to what you were talking about, and I was ending to.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, sometimes in the way that Americans talk about Christian nationalism, you might think, oh, this started in 2016 with Donald Trump, or oh, this started in the 1980s with the rise of the religious right. The truth is, there's always been forms of Christian nationalism in American politics, going back even to the era of the U.S. founding in the late 18th century. These were debates about the religious nature and religious character of the United States. I would argue that there's been kind of an ebb and flow pattern of Christian nationalism in American history. The founding era of the U.S., the kind of 1776 to 1789, was actually one of the more secular eras in American history. Was not a religious nationalist era. And then there's a huge revival called the Second Great Awakening that begins in the 19th century, and there's a surge in religious nationalism that really culminates in the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s, where both sides in the Civil War were very much framing their cause in Christian nationalist terms. We are the righteous ones. We are fighting against the evil ones. And obviously, the North was victorious in that war, and I think it was more on the side of righteousness than the South. But that religious nationalist framing was very prominent. And then after World War II, as we enter the Cold War, there's another surge in Christian nationalist thinking. We are the godly Americans against the godless communists. This is the era of McCarthyism. This is when some of those markers of Christian nationalism get embedded within American religious life, especially adding "In God We Trust" to our currency, and adding "Under God" to our Pledge of Allegiance, to our flag. And what we're experiencing right now, I would argue, is another big surge in religious nationalism, one that was in some ways triggered by a lot of cultural changes that the United States underwent, especially in the 1960s. You had the Civil Rights Movement. You had the 1965 Immigration Act that opened up U.S. immigration to a much wider swath of the globe, including a lot more religious diversity. And you've had a lot of cultural changes, including a real enforcement of this idea of separation of church and state that was always present in American politics and jurisprudence, but had kind of been not always enacted. But since the 60s, we've become a much more secular nation, a much more plural and diverse nation. And now we're experiencing a real backlash to that. And I'd argue that the New Apostolic Reformation is a part of that story, a part of that backlash to these cultural shifts that we have undergone in the last 60 or so years. And the New Apostolic Reformation is a leadership network that was formed in the 1990s, especially around Fuller Theological Seminary, where I attended, and around a leader named C. Peter Wagner, who was an evangelical, was a seminary professor, and who came to believe that this is a charismatic Christian movement. So charismatic in Christian terminology is referring to the more supernaturalist style of Christianity, with a belief that we need to recapture the practices and ethos of the early church, especially around miracles, around speaking in tongues, around prophecy. And so these charismatic believers who are gathering around Peter Wagner come to believe that the church needs to be led once again by apostles and prophets, these forms of leadership that begin very much at the beginning of the early church, but then kind of die out in Christian history. And most of the leaders who participate in these networks are identify as either apostles or prophets or both. And they were kind of in the backdrop, kind of in the margins of American politics and the American religious right up until Donald Trump enters the scene. And then they are some of the first religious leaders to endorse him. They become a number of his advisors, come out of these NAR networks. And even his closest religious advisor, Paula White Cain, who is now head of the White House Faith Office, she's not in the NAR networks per se, but she runs in those same circles, has called herself an apostle, believes in prophecy. And so she was kind of instrumental in kind of brokering this relationship between these kind of fringy NAR type leaders and then the White House establishment. And I argue in my book that this has really precipitated a massive shift in the culture of the religious right, a radicalization of the religious right, and a move into a more accelerationist form of politics that has very much synced up with Trump and the greater Make America Great Again movement that he's leading, that have revolutionized the political right in the U.S.
I'm thinking about radicalization of the religious right and thinking about the situation here in Israel. And I would address the question to Mikhael. Well, we don't have prophecies and we don't have people who prophesize, but what happened in Israel and what happened to the religious nationalism, which is very different when we talk about the radical religious nationalism in Israel today, how it developed from the religious national movement that we grew up in to what we see now in Israel. So, Michael, if you can explain.
Yeah. Thanks, and thank you, Matthew. Matthew, it was so fascinating, and also I think there's some things which are just so different, and it's actually helpful to the extent that I understand the narrative to sort of talk about something different. I mean, religious nationalism, which in a sense calls itself that in Israel, has been around since the founding of the state to some extent. And while I would say primarily the self-understanding of religious Zionism was, and that's the terminology that I'll use because I think that's itself terminology, and I think actually rather important, is that they understood Zionism as a secular heretical movement on one hand. On the other hand, religious Zionists, as opposed to religious anti-Zionists, saw the movement as either helpful politically, so even if they were ambivalent to it religiously, they found it helpful politically in saving Jewish lives primarily, but not only. And there was a small, what would then be called messianic strand, and I actually think one shouldn't call it messianic necessarily today, which saw the movement as being which saw Zionism as being a temporary movement, a temporary secular movement, which would then be replaced by religious spiritual leadership, and would actually lead the way to redemption, which would have, and they viewed redemption, if you look at earlier texts of like Rav Kook area, but not only, also area of like leading rabbis in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and I think even to the beginning of the 70s. There would be a point in which the presence of God would be complete, felt. God would respond to this process of the beginning of the redemption, which was first sort of manifested by secular leadership, and then through religious leadership become closer to the end of days. I think that would be a sort of a rough categorization of religious nationalism in its early days. The ambivalent strand regarding Zionism was probably stronger at first. Religious Zionism of more messianic variety became much more dominant in the 60s and 70s, especially around the Six-Day War. But I think really important to stress was an optimistic, and I'll use this word carefully, universalistic movement in the sense that it saw redemption as a process which would affect the entire world. The reason I stress that point is because the religious Zionism of today, while much more dominant politically for a plethora of political and organizational and structural and theological reasons, it actually does not use universalist terminology or optimistic terminology, or even usually messianic terminology, meaning current religious Zionism, current dominant strands of religious Zionism, while they use sometimes the language of redemption, redemption would be categorized by domination of Israel, of Israelis and the state, and Jews in Israel of the entire land. So even if you look at perhaps the most symbolic movement of the last 20 years in this regard, which is those who ascend to the Temple Mount, something which was not allowed by and still not allowed by standard Orthodox practices. There is no point and if you read the literature, there's no point or little point, or it's largely irrelevant whether at the end of the building of the Temple Mount, God will present himself, thereby ending existential exile. Rather, we will complete ourselves as sovereigns who dominate the region and become fully ourselves as a nation. In that sense, I would argue that religious nationalism in its current form is actually a heightened form of secular nationalism with religious language. And I think that's relevant, particularly in our context, because we tend to look, definitely when looking at the Israeli context, we tend to look at religious Zionism as a group coming from the outside, so to speak, and taking over Zionism against its will. That's, I think, inaccurate. Secular Zionism always leaned into theological terminology, particularly regarding exile and return, but also regarding the symbolic significance of the state. And while it is true that religious Zionists have an Orthodox praxis, have a heightened understanding of the theology of exile of return, they really lean into Zionist terminology and secular Zionist terminology and secular Zionist mythology. So in that sense, while the country is growing through religification, which is a word that it gets a hadata, a word which has been used in the last 10 years to talk about the sort of the growing dominance of religion in the public sphere. Religion is going through nationalification or secularization, which I think is relevant as well in this conversation. I think the dominance of religious Zionism also plays into the fact that religious Zionism has always been able to explain Zionism to Zionists in a way which allows for a lot of things which liberalism doesn't. And I'll just explain a bit about that for a second. The term Israel is a Jewish and democratic state was not formed by religious people, but rather by secular liberal hegemonies. If you think about where the function of the word Jewish and Jewish democratic state, it is, to the best of my knowledge, always to allow for things that liberal democracy doesn't allow. So liberal democracy will allow certain criteria for what it means to be a Western normative state. But however, we are allowed something which liberal democracy doesn't allow us because of the Jewish part of that framework. And I think that's really significant, because when we think about the holders of that term, Jewish and democratic, those whose purpose or those whose role it is to explain what Jewish means to the Jewish and democratic framework have almost always been religious Zionists, which give them an incredible amount of cultural and national significance in their ability to explain the story of Jews in Israel in modern nationalist times to the entire country, which becomes much more complicated when we look at secular liberal hegemonies. So that relationship between secular liberal Zionism and religious non-liberal Zionism has always been, to an extent, religious Zionists get a seat at the table, but what they get in response, what secular Zionists get is somebody, we would say in Hebrew, with a kosher certificate to explain to them what they do. And that, I think, allows for religious Zionist dominance in the public sphere. I hope that made sense in our context. I am sure that in many senses there are sort of, yeah. Okay.
Sorry, we'll keep
Sorry.
the floor open for questions later on.
Yeah.
It is very confusing and challenging, and I would like to ask. So if the religious movement uses secular terminology now, if I try to kind of summarize it, when we talk about the typical the kind of religious nationalism that we see today, the more radical religious nationalism. What is the impact, maybe to explain what is the impact on the possibility for democracy and pluralism in Israel today? Does it mean that what do
Look,
we have to recover from, or to do in order to avoid losing the possibility for democracy and pluralism with what happened to religious nationalism today in Israel?
I mean, this is obviously, I first, Matthew introduced himself before as an academic, and I am not one. I'm an activist, so you're going to get heightened political answers for every question. I will apologize in advance and always claim subjectivity. To the best of my understanding, the question of democracy in Israel doesn't go through, it goes through separation of church and state, and it goes through liberal self-understandings, but most importantly, it goes to the Jewish-Arab question. It always has been the question of how do we articulate a nationalism which doesn't suppose ethnic supremacy. That's a challenge of Zionist, secular, and liberal and religious alike, and it has been, I think, since the pre-founding of the State of Israel, and obviously much more today. I'm also, as one could imagine in this country, it's very hard to be optimistic in the last couple of years and to imagine politically even the end of the war or some sort of peaceful resolution comes a close second to imagining messianic times. So I can point to a trajectory, but it's obviously even in terms of the most basic emotional sense of understanding sort of the incredible dire challenges that we have now in the region, I think is important to state from the get-go. I will sort of still answer your question to the best of my ability, which is that I think a theology of dominance would need to be countered by a theology which allows for democracy. So one would need to construct a counter theology for the state. And I'll give examples of where this was in the past. It's not something new to now, but one would need to construct a counter theology, if you will, to how Jews live in the land of Israel in a way which doesn't dominate Palestinians. And that, again, goes through re-articulating or challenging religious nationalist sentiment or religious Zionist sentiment, but it also goes through challenging a lot of secular Zionist theology. So challenges of exile and return, questions of all sorts of words which are deeply from the religious, but are still sort of articulated here by secular. For example, the fact that we will always is always a term that you know is You're leading into the religious when you say always. So we will always need to have a majority, right? If when Jews say we will always need to have a majority, that means that we're constructing a theology in this country, which is predicated on the fact that we will always have an enemy, and that is predicated on biblical narratives. It's predicated on some Talmudic narratives. It's predicated on religious nationalist narratives. So that would be an example. But questions of negation of diaspora, that would also lean into the theology, and so on and so forth. So I think in order to construct a proper democracy, one would need to re-articulate nationalism, binationalism, all sorts of questions which always existed on the fringes of Zionism. So this isn't even non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, but it would definitely be on the fringes of Zionists. So you could find as early as in the 20s, you could find, if you look at sort of like, the Iron Wall, which is like Jabotinsky's famous articulation of Jewish nationalism, and he makes it clear that it's very secular, although I would argue that there's a lot of theology in there. If you look at what he's responding to the notion of my national. Like he's very sorry, translating in my head. He's responding to the notion of binationalism. He's responding to the idea that one doesn't need to be in complete dominance, ethnic dominance in the region, but rather can form some articulate. Lastly, I would just say, in order to close that, interestingly, I actually think that up until the 50s, the largest amount of voices who are challenging this narrative of ethnic supremacy, as well as exclusivity, right? Jewish exclusivity over the land, are actually coming from religious areas. So if you look at people like the Rav Amiel, who was chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, even early Rav Kook, definitely the Brit Shalom people, which was sort of the binationalist movement in the 40s, people like Gershom Shalom, Hugo Bergman, Buber, all of those folks are coming from deep theological language. I wouldn't necessarily categorize them as incredibly secular, but are trying to articulate a language which can allow for democracy and not for supremacy and exclusivity. Do I think that that's sort of an immediate possibility today? Not so much, but I would argue that if one wants to fight for a true liberal democracy, one would need to create a context where every citizen can be equal to every other citizen, and the demos is every citizen, which has not been the dominant form of Zionism, either secular or religious, since day one.
So actually, it's not a discussion about religious nationalism, because all the nationalism in Judaism, in Zionism, is actually quite religious.
Yes.
In a way. Matthew, we can go to the American context. What do you think the impact of these right-wing movement and religious nationalist movement, how do they impact democracy? Are they a threat for democracy? They serve democracy? They pluralism in America today? How do you see that?
Well, I would argue that religious nationalism is always in tension with pluralism, and usually in tension with democracy. And so it's not always in tension with democracy, I'd argue. I mean, or at least it's the tension can be very low, right? So to use a kind of iconic instance, right? When there's a new king or queen of England, that they have a religious ceremony where they crown the king, and it's the Archbishop of Canterbury putting the crown on the king, and all the nobles are gathered singing religious hymns, right? It is kind of an iconic, paradigmatic instance of religious nationalism. But is that a real threat to British democracy? I don't think so. I think it's more vestigial, right? It's more a kind of hearkening back to a bygone era, and very much built into the kind of narratives of British democracy. So I don't think that states calibrate themselves very differently around religion. I sometimes say with our students that religions are old, nations are new. And so the nations that have emerged, these modern nations, the post-Westphalian since the 17th century nations that we have today are all having to calibrate themselves around these very old systems of belief and identity that exist within our religious traditions. But it's always in tension with pluralism, because pluralism, and I think Mikhael was articulating it very well, pluralism is about equality. It's about a space for everyone. That doesn't mean that everyone it comes into agreement about everything, right? Pluralism is there to protect the differences, is there to protect the space to be different. And I think that is not exclusively a project of liberal democracy, but in the world today, liberal democracies tend to be the places that are trying to champion pluralism. And religious nationalist states tend to be the ones that are trying to dismantle or overthrow pluralism. And in the US today, what we had in the rise of the religious right is how we kind of speak about it here in the 1980s with figures like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and in the kind of Ronald Reagan era of the religious right. It was wanting to work within the framework of democracy. Right, one of the major Christian nationalist organizations of the 1980s was called the Moral Majority. Right, and the idea was if the majority of Americans are Christian. In fact, up until 1990, it was about 90% of Americans identified as Christian. And so if we can just mobilize the Christians and get them all voting in the same way, then we can Christianize the nation in some kind of vague sense. And I'd argue that that was all playing within the boundaries and the rules of democracy. They might have had anti-pluralistic aims, but they were willing to play within the rules. What we have seen with the rise of the New Apostolic Reformation, with this shift into this more accelerationist mode, this more radical mode of Christian nationalism in the US, and I sometimes want to distinguish because Christian nationalism is a big spectrum, right, in the US. And just to give an instance, a few years ago, Pew Research Center did a survey, and they asked, do you think the United States should be a Christian nation? And 45% of Americans said yes to that question. And so you could read that as 45% of the country is Christian nationalist because they want it to be a Christian nation, right? But then Pew followed up and said, okay, so should our Congress use the Bible to make laws? And all these people said, no. Oh, so should the United States government declare itself to be a Christian nation, basically in violation of our First Amendment and our Constitution? Oh, no. Right? Only like 10 to 15% kept saying yes, all the way down the line. The majority of people who said yes to that first kind of bracketing question actually had very nuanced views about the relationship between religion and state. And so I don't want to kind of overcompensate and say, oh, well, anyone who says that they believe the US should be a Christian nation is therefore an extremist, right? Well, people have complicated relationships in the way that they interrelate their national identity and their religious identity. The threat to pluralism and to democracy today is that Christians today only make up about 62% of the population. White Christians are no longer a majority of the country. And so this backlash that we're experiencing is, at least right now, maybe a borderline majoritarian backlash, but it is very quickly going to be a minoritarian backlash, where it'll be a minority coalition that embraces these ideas of Christian nationalism. And they know they can't win elections on that premise. And so what happened in the 2020 election in the lead up to January 6th was they said, hey, we were entitled to win this election. We should have won this election. God told us that we were going to win this election. And so any result that is not that outcome is illegitimate. And they acted to try to overthrow our democracy on January 6th. They weren't successful per se, but they had a huge success this past November in getting Trump reelected. And I would say, I don't think I can reasonably characterize the United States of America as a democracy today. If we are a democracy, we are a struggling, verging on illiberal democracy today, because all of our institutions are actively being dismantled. And some of that had begun before the 2024 election, but it has been kicked into high gear since Donald Trump entered office in January. And we are on a trajectory right now, not inevitable, but a trajectory right now where you will start to see pluralism disappear in the United States as a value, And the forces that are in control of our government right now see themselves as putting together an authoritarian state and creating that gradually. And I think there's going to be a real question come our next election next fall, whether that will be a free and fair election, and whether the Republican Party will accept the outcome of that election. And so I think we are, in some ways, not as far gone as the situation that Mikhael is describing in Israel, right, where a lot of these questions of pluralism, I think, are off the table for a large population in Israel, not for everyone. In the U.S., I'd say we're still more on the knife's edge, where we could tip either way depending on events in the next few years.
You both talk about a spectrum of religious nationalism, and of course now we're dealing with more extreme edge of this spectrum. But Matthew, if you can define the moment, if I understand correctly, so it's just the fear that Christians becoming minority that turn this rhetoric of religious nationalism to be more extreme and expressing God's will by prophecy? Or, I mean, what's the turning point that people searching for spirituality, how this small minority of radical religious nationalism became so dominant and influential in this particular timing? I mean, in what moment it happens?
Well, as with anything, there are many moments along the way. I think a moment where you can see it really crystallizing is around the 2016 election, where Donald Trump is first elected, where you have Donald Trump did not, in the same way that Donald Trump has come into US politics and remade the Republican Party in his image and brought a lot of these marginal figures, Steve Bannon, Steve Miller, some of these people that you hear in the news, they were not mainstream figures in Republican politics 20 years ago. But Donald Trump brought them into the center of this MAGA movement, and that MAGA movement has taken over our Republican Party. The same thing has happened within American evangelicalism. A new leadership cohort has come in with Donald Trump, riding his coattails and vouching for him to their communities, and they've become very, very powerful. Just to give an illustration of this, so I talked about the moral majority, right? This idea of, well, if we mobilize people, we can use democracy to Christianize the nation. The major NAR idea when it comes to politics is something called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And the Seven Mountain Mandate is this idea that you can divide up every society into 7 arenas of influence: government, education, family, arts and entertainment, media, business. And in every one of those, they conceptualize this as a mountain. And they say in every society, the tops of those mountains, the position of control over the government, position of control over education, position of control over the family, is either in the hands of Satan and the demons or God and the Christians. And so Christians need to take over the 7 mountains, need to rise to positions of influence and take over these cultural pillars, and then Christianize society from the top down. That's a very different conception than the moral majority, right? Because suddenly they're saying, hey, we need to take over because we're entitled to power and God has told us we're entitled to power, and the other side is demonic, as opposed to, hey, we're in a democracy and we're going to try to work within those rules to advance our interests. And that is much more the mode that has taken over. And that parallels the MAGA movement's general sensibility, that they are the righteous crusaders for Western civilization. And their enemies, the woke left, the communists, the socialists that are they're against, those people are evil. And they are on the side of good. And so they are going to advance good by always winning. And they won't tolerate not winning, because that would be allowed to allow evil to triumph, right? So these things dovetail together, and it is a very powerful rhetorical framework for a lot of people who, most people don't walk around thinking about liberal democracy and the rule of law and checks and balances and how to calibrate a pluralistic society, right? Most people are just thinking like, I'm making my way through the day, I'm trying to survive. Hey, I'm a Christian. It sounds good. They're saying these positive things about Christianity. And so there's this tiny core that is of what I would call Christian supremacists who are very much united around the Trump administration, very much ingrained in positions of power, who are driving our politics. And there's a whole horde of other Christians who are voting along with them and marching along with them, whom, if you actually presented the full-fledged ideology to them, might balk at it. But because they're getting it through propaganda, they accept it and wouldn't go along with it.
And if I'm going back to Mikhael, mentioned Christian supremacy, so we also talked a little bit about Jewish supremacy and how it's used in the language of the Israel of the religious nationalist, more extreme Israeli Jews. And then when I was hearing about the Seven Mountains idea, I was thinking about how also in Israel we see a phenomena of the religious nationalists who try to take over this mountain, the politics and the army and the education system. And again, it's connected to Jewish supremacy. How do you see that, Michael? Do you think it's a similar phenomena of the religious nationalist right trying to take over? Can it resonate
Yeah.
what
I,
Matthew was talking about?
I was thinking, as I was listening, and looking for similarities. I mean, maybe leave aside rhetoric, which, I think in Israeli terminology,
Very good.
at the very least seems to be a bit more subtle, than devils and mountains. But I do think it can be split into two in terms of if we look at the religious nationalists, religious Zionists as a sector, then we can very clearly identify a move to position in places of leadership, primarily in military, also in police, media. It's been a process which has been heavily documented. But I think, and also in that regard, sometimes with the disregard for sort of like larger public opinions, definitely if you read texts from places like Haramor or sort of the more like staunch religious right, even more so in like sort of Ginsburg and the more hilltop youth settler right, sort of like an avant-garde, pushing Israeli society against its will in sort of a cultural and nationalist role. So there's definitely part of that, and I think, and it is worth mentioning that to some extent, these movements are having conversations with each other in the last 20 years, perhaps a bit less, I think, in the last couple of years than in the past. But definitely, if you look at like the beginning of the 2000s, definitely in the settler movement, there's a lot of relationship between Christian Zionism and certain parts of the settler right, because there are certain parts which are incredibly anti-Christian, which leads to other dynamics. But that being said, I think if we look at the larger sort of religious nationalist perspective, which is beyond religious Zionists, so then too, I would argue that there are specific areas in government and in control, which since the dawn of the state need to be controlled by Jews. So even and I think this is an argument that you'd hear a lot from Palestinian citizens of Israel, that even those who call for you would hear a critique that they would say a lot of liberal voices would say, I want everybody to get an equal check, but those who are signing the check would need to be Jewish. So those who construct the language to who is allocated entry to the land, for example, who's allowed to be an immigrant. That question is I think very, very, very mainstream as to the question of immigration is very mainstream, that the Jewish immigration operates differently than Palestinian immigration. And worth mentioning, the Jewish immigration goes through religious conversion. So even in the most secular regard, immigration goes through religious conversion, something which is very easily can be constructed as religious nationalism.
You're muted, Hana. Hana, you're muted.
Sorry.
Okay.
I maybe we have to start to wrap up, and I would like to ask one last question, and then we'll open the floor for question from the audience. Maybe about the reaction of the society. I have plenty more question, and I think I can continue the conversation for many more hours. But I want to ask you, what is the response of the general society to the extreme expression of religious nationalism? There are people talking about strategies to resist it or to adopt, or how, what are the reaction, and if there are any activism to respond to these phenomena in both contexts. Maybe we'll start with Mikhael and then Matthew in the American context.
Sure. First, I think in terms of the general atmosphere, and this is you can see this very much in polling data, that the country definitely since the war breakout has become much more religious in the public sphere. That has to do partially with leadership, but it also has to do with an existential crisis and language that people use to deal with existential crisis. So you go on a bus, a lot more people saying Psalms than in the past, a lot of more people wearing tzitzit. The language is much more religious and so on, and also coming from what we call in Israel traditional society, which many times just basically means, but increasingly less so, but it many times means people who come from Middle Eastern origin, Jews who come from Middle Eastern origin, where the whole separation between religious and secular is a bit more nuanced. I would say that the dominant liberal response up until now, and this is true since I think since sort of you see it more and more since let's say the second half of the 10s or so, like 2017, 2018, you start seeing campaigns of a secular minority trying to raise the walls of its cities. I remember that being a Haaretz caricature sometime in the last election, that we need to protect ourselves from the encroaching religion in our public sphere. So initially it's a fight over the public sphere, and then it becomes a fight of sort of saving what can be left to secularism, and an attempt to try to push out religion at the gates. I would say that's one option, which while it doesn't necessarily resonate with me personally, I can definitely understand how it develops sociologically. It's very hard to not have religion sort of everywhere you look right now. And I can understand that for people who see that as a threat, that's a very troubling threat. So Haaretz newspaper would probably be, I think, the strongest voice of that, even if you look at the last Friday sort of magazine, they did a serious piece on the incoming head of secret police, and just sort of a demonic, if we go back to the demonic figure of the kippah wearing general, which was pointed out by a lot of Israelis as being very anti-religious. And I imagine to some extent it was out of a fear of religion, and one could argue justified or not justified. I would say a minority option, which is the one that I represent, is trying to articulate another language of religion, which corresponds to people's sense of democratic and egalitarian values. So for us, the challenge would be in the faithful left. The challenge would be articulating a language which bridges the gap between how people envisioned their grandparents, which were largely traditional individuals, to how people envisioned their sense of equality and democracy, definitely on the center and the left. And I think part of the growing popularity of a movement like the faithful left is because a lot of people in this country, including secular people, are to some extent traditional. So the language of sort of a heightened fear of religion is just not going to be relevant for a large majority of Israelis, even if they live ultimately a secular lifestyle. Then you'd find them fasting on Yom Kippur, lighting Hanukkah candles, and so on. So they would still need to create a language for themselves which bridges that gap. Both strategies are definitely minority strategies. Both take an incredibly amount of time. I would say that maybe just in closing for this part, that a lot of what we do on the practical political is actually learned from sort of the religious nationalist playbook, which I think is an important political playbook. We tend to underestimate the political work of these movements, which were highly motivated and highly political from the get-go, and look at things in sort of a long road prism, which I think is also important democratically, to understand how systems work and try to understand how one can embed oneself in one system, and for the greater cause, be it what it may. So I would say those are two responses that I can think of.
Okay, and Matthew, what do you think there? How do you see the responses within the American society?
Let me outline very quickly 3 responses that I see broadly that are all, I think, quite unhelpful, and then try to see if I can articulate one that might be helpful. So first, I mean, the religious nationalists, the Christian nationalists and Christian supremacists in the U.S. right now are openly talking about a religious revival, that we are undergoing a religious revival, a revitalization of Christianity, more conversions. And they've got a lot of energy. I mean, they're virtually getting government support in a lot of cases, not necessarily directly, but through kind of the atmospherics of this new administration that is articulating itself as a champion of Christianity and of Christians. And so a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon and moving in that direction. And this is there's a growing trend of radicalization of middle-of-the-road and conservative Christians in the U.S., moving more and more into this MAGA coalition and Christian supremacist mode. The second unhelpful response that I see happening is a lot of Christians are looking at all of this and saying, that's not Christian, right? That because they have in their mind an idealized vision of what Christianity is, and they say, well, that's not what Jesus taught us, and that's not what we read in our reading of the New Testament, and so therefore this is not Christian. Well, right, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. These folks are all saying that they are Christian. They are all saying the creeds without crossing their fingers. They are Christian, right? And so I think it's unhelpful to try to present this idealized vision of Christianity that is completely at odds with what most people experience. And then similar to what Mikhael was just saying, we're seeing a broad shift, and this has been going on for decades, maybe are accelerating a little bit right now, of people fleeing from Christianity and from Christian identity. I mean, when you, like I said, in 1990, surveys showed that about 90% of the US population identified as Christian. Today, it's around 62%. That is a rapid secularization in a society, right? I mean, you're talking about 1% of the population a year is stopping calling itself Christian, right? That is a very rapid shift, and that's part of why we're seeing this backlash. I find that unhelpful. I understand why people would leave being Christian, but I find that unhelpful in that for every Christian of good conscience who leaves because American Christianity has become so toxic, the toxicity gains influence within that, right? Because the Christians of good conscience are leaving. And so the coalition of toxicity is growing. And that's dangerous. So in the same way that I am very disillusioned with the way that American democracy is playing out, I'm still voting, right? And in the same way that I'm very disillusioned with the way that American Christianity is playing out at the moment, I still want to be a participating member and help to try to push in the other direction. And so that brings me to the fourth, more hopeful. And I'm finishing up a book right now that'll hopefully come out next fall, that is trying to speak in this kind of theological voice against Christian supremacy, against Christian nationalism. But part of what I've realized in the process is if we're going to deal with Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy, we got to go back and deal with a lot of Christian history, because the Christian nationalists of today are very much in line with a lot of Christian history, of Christian imperialism, of Constantine, of the Holy Roman Empire, of the Crusades, right? The Christian history is not innocent. Christian history gave us the products that we are experiencing today. And I think we got to reckon with how Christianity has related to Jews, how Christianity is related to Muslims, how there's been slaughter in the name of Christianity has been a marker of Christian history. And so we have to reckon with that, I think, in order to grapple with the present. That's hard theological work, but I think it's really important. And as Mikhael was saying, right, in the US right now, the propaganda that is holding Donald Trump in power and keeping this coalition of Christians around him, that propaganda is theological. And if we are going to respond to it, we can't just use the language of human rights and liberal democracy and the Enlightenment. We have to use theological language to respond to the propaganda, right? Because the people who are persuadable, the people in the middle, they aren't sitting around thinking about abstractions about the rule of law and the separation of powers, right? They're thinking about their practical things, and they're thinking in theological terms. And so we need to find ways of articulating a theology that will hopefully put some steel in the spine of the resistance.
In a way, very similar to the faithful left, this movement
Yes.
that Mikhael is leading. Thank you very much. I would like to open the floor for questions. There are some questions that were raised in the chat. So I think, Adif, we can open the microphone for questions, or do you want me to? Do we have many questions? I haven't seen, but okay, so maybe I will just a couple of questions that I see in the chat, and then maybe you can open the microphone for others to ask. So the question for Matthew, after 2 years of notarism, are we here in Israel to expect a change in the outlook of the evangelical groups that will coming here when the travel gates reopen? Will we find them more vocally pro-Jewish supremacy here? Will we sense this shift that you're speaking of? Do you think that would have a practical impact on Israel?
I think
You
it will
haven't talked
inevitably.
about, you wanted to talk about Zionist Christians, but maybe this question can lead you to talk about that and its impact on the situation in Israel.
Yeah, yeah, and Mikhail brought this up, and I think it's a really important part of the conversation, especially as we're talking about the U.S. and Israel, is we tend to think about religious nationalisms as these kind of siloed entities, right? Oh, Christians care about Christian nationalism and Christianizing their nations. And the reality as it's playing out right now is there's a growing sense of global fascistic pluralism where all kinds of forms of fascism and religious nationalism are finding ways to collaborate and cooperate. And one of the oldest of those collaborations and cooperations is what we call Christian Zionism. And let me try to define that very quickly because I think people get confused about it. I think Christian Zionism is Christians who support the current state of Israel for theological reasons. So Joe Biden is a Christian and he's a Zionist, but he's not a Christian Zionist, right? He supports Israel. He's a Zionist who also happens to be a devout Catholic, but it's not theological for him as far as I can tell. But Christian Zionism especially has hold within evangelicalism. And what we're seeing in accompanying this shift in evangelical culture in the US overall is a shift that's going on in global evangelical culture that's moving more in the direction of charismatic spirituality. And so Christian Zionism has become a more charismatic movement globally. That's also meant that it's become more international. So there's rampant Christian Zionism today in Brazil and South Korea and Africa, all over the globe, in part because it's become more attached to this charismatic spirituality around miracles, around a more charismatic form of apocalypticism. If you really want to go deep on this, I did a whole like 4-hour course on Christian Zionism and Messianic Judaism, which using it in the American sense of Messianic Judaism of Christians who claim to also be Jewish, right? But the way that those are entwined and embedded within American politics today, yes, you're going to see a real shift. And I would argue that Christian Zionism usually is a form of Christian supremacy with a small carve out temporary for the state of Israel because they see Jews as instruments in enacting their theological agenda. I don't think that the majority of Christian Zionists have a real deep concern for Jews as Jews. They in some sense want to see the end of Judaism ultimately through Jesus, but they have a temporary carve out for the modern state of Israel.
So maybe for the tour guides that would benefit from that in a way, but maybe not exactly the way we want. There was another question. Well, the question is for Michael, but I think it would be interesting to hear from both of you. But the language, Michael, you talked about the language that the religious nationalist radicals are using, that we have to find learn from them and to use it, but in a positive way. Maybe you can elaborate and give some suggestion to the language that we can use.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is that one can't be purely utilitarian. I mean, we are talking about religion, so I know there are attempts every election in Israel, yeah, to speak more Jewish. The thing is that inauthenticity in religious language is usually sort of not very effective, and I'd also say from a sort of personal faith-based perspective, it's not very compelling. Um, I would, the challenge. So the challenge of finding a language which conforms to to an ideology is already tricky or problematic. Yeah, I also I would say so. I mean, it's really important for me to get that out of the way. So I think if one doesn't believe in this kind of thing, when there's plenty of other arguments and rationales to uphold one's values and not use religious terminology just because it's effective. Um, from my perspective, as a religious Jew, I would say that is the primary work at our table is how do you articulate what God wants from you and what God wants from our people at any given time. The book that I wrote, End of Days, is an attempt to at least start answering that question while analyzing what's happening on the other side. But a lot of it would go back to the traditional. I don't think one can come to any conclusion if when looking at our 2000 years of text. But I do think one can come to different conclusions, and I think I think one needs to make one can make a solid argument for a nation which is skeptical of violence, which is really interested in care for the vulnerable and for the weak, which is skeptical of power and nationalism, which knows how to guard its ability to use force. I think our tradition is like many faith-based traditions is full of that, and at the same time is full of things which we perhaps like less, such as vengeance, supremacy, downright disdain for those who aren't us, and so on. And here there is a moral challenge, which is how do we treat our role as people of, in the Jewish context, of people who understand their covenant with God and want to imitate him to the best of our ability. For me, in order to not make this completely, we're talking in a very specific context. For me, I don't think that God is happy with our behavior in the land of Israel these last 2 years. I think this is not how Jews should behave. This is how I read prayer. This is how I read the central text. And it's also, what my mom and dad taught me. That doesn't mean that it's the true one and authentic voice, but it does mean that there's a serious and a tradition to that. And that means that one needs to engage with this tradition seriously and critically. I think that answer tends to be incredibly non-cynical. It's hard in a Zoom context to be able to convey sort of that lack of cynicism. But it's something which I truly believe and I'm committed to. We have, maybe I'll just sort of end with this. We have a very strong tradition of virtue ethics, which has been pushed to the side or depoliticized by a lot of sort of current political actors. For me, it's unsurprising that in the faithful left, there's a leaning towards the ethical, there's a leaning towards the imitation of God, and there's a leaning towards the mystical. In that sense, there's actually something which is for us in this contemporary understanding of faithful left, which is actually different from our maybe parents' liberal religious tradition, which was an attempt to create a version of liberal democracy which rests on Jewish texts as well. I don't only think that's a difference of faith. I also think it has to do with the fact that I live in a post-liberal world, and as Matthew said, it's hard to lean back on arguments of sort of rule of law and democracy and so on, and I'm going to add a verse to the end of that, in a context where everything is so all over the place, and then you need to lean to something different. We lean to the traditions of our virtue ethicists, of the Kabbalists of Tzfat, of a lot of people who are doing Jewish Muslim work, which is most of the Middle Ages, frankly, in Jewry, who are having conversations, Jewish Islamic conversations. So I think that's the language that we look into currently now, and the movement here in Israel.
Well, I guess one of the differences in the language is that you talk about what you think that God wants, and I think the more radical nationalists would say they know what God wants. And
I would say that it's not. No, I'm
you
to just
know
make
what.
myself less normal in this conversation. No,
No.
I do believe in prophecy, and I do believe in redemption, and I do believe that God cries for what we do in Gaza.
Yeah. No,
I just think that I might be wrong, and I think that they think that as well. Ultimately,
you think they think it,
yeah,
they think that as well? Okay.
yeah, I think I think modesty is a virtue which should be held in the left, but is also many times held in the right. I'm sure they think they're right, and I'm sure I think I'm right. But I think people can change, and I think people know that they themselves can change. But I'm not. This isn't. This is really important for me to get across. This isn't a parable. This is the real thing. This is we are commanded to behave in a certain way on the political issue. So I can understand why, from a secular liberal position, what I just said would be considered incredibly problematic. And I think that's important to also recognize as well, that if I was sitting here with a staunch secular liberal articulator of that ideology, I can understand why they would respond back to me. That's actually pretty dangerous, and that's something that I recognize and respect in this conversation.
Thank you. A different question for Matthew about Catholics. Where do they fit in to the conversation of radical religious nationalism in general, if you can say a word about that, because I think we have many Catholics in the audience.
Yeah, so in the US, about 20 to 25% of the population identifies as Catholic. Again, total of 62% Christian. So they're not the majority of Christians, but they're a sizable chunk of Christians. Historically, American Christian nationalism has traditionally been framed in Protestant terms. And it's only really in roughly the 1940s, 1950s, you begin to see Catholics being integrated in, right? It was oftentimes American Christian nationalism, right? If you think back to the Ku Klux Klan, was deeply anti-Catholic, right? And Catholics were part of the groups to be excluded from this Anglo-Protestant nation that they were conceptualizing. So, but today there's a very active Catholic contingent within American Christian nationalism and even within American Christian supremacy. J.D. Vance is an avatar of that movement. Sometimes it goes under the heading of Catholic integralism or radical traditionalist Catholicism. There's kind of a Catholic far right, and there are multiple Protestant far rights. Sometimes those intersect and sometimes those conflict. And so I think the strange thing about the coalition that Trump has built is that in some ways the central narrative, and I would argue that the New Apostolic Reformation was very instrumental in building this narrative, is of Trump as a sort of Messiah. And they'll even use messianic language in reference to Trump, especially since the assassination attempts last summer. And they'll talk about Trump as a kind of messianic figure. And that narrative is what everyone else plugs into, right? The neo-Nazis can plug in. Trump is a kind of white savior. The Catholics can plug in. He's protecting this kind of Catholic vision. The Protestants can plug in. The QAnon can plug in. He's going to save us from this nefarious quasi-Jewish cabal, right? And that all of these narratives ultimately can kind of find some traction with this idea of Trump as Messiah. When Trump disappears from the scene, which could be tomorrow, could be 10 years from now, I have no idea what happens to that coalition, right? Because their aims and agendas are fundamentally contradictory, but right now they're all united around Trump. And I think there's going to be a lot of jockeying for power, and even including within Trump's second term here, as these different factions try to sort out what a post-Trump MAGA America is going to look like. But for now, yeah, Catholics are part of the tapestry.
Also part of the discussion. If someone wants to open the microphone and ask a question, maybe you can give you minutes for that before we wrap up the webinar. If there's anyone who want to open the microphone and ask a question, if Ophir you would like to add something.
Well, perhaps following on Matthew's last remark, Jackie Feldman, you'd like to ask your question? You're muted, Jackie.
There we go. Thank you very much for this discussion, very enlightening discussion from both of you. I want to ask, how do leaders manage to rally Christians behind a leader, a president whose every behavior is the antithesis of Christianity? Does the desire for power trump everything?
And I would just say we can also ask similar question about the situation in Israel as well.
Yeah.
But let's hear from Matthew first.
I actually think you might find answers from some of the same references to some of the same Bible passages, in fact. So as I said, this idea of the way that the NAR kind of plugs in with Trump, one of the things that is central to that is its idea of prophecy. And Hana has kind of referenced this a couple times. They believe, many Christians believe in biblical prophecy. What I think Mikhael was more kind of articulating, right? This belief that there are passages in the Bible, be it the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, that allude to future events that have not yet been fulfilled. That's a very common belief within Christianity. The charismatics who are in power now believe in modern prophecy, that there are prophets among them, hundreds, thousands of these prophets who hear directly from God and speak to communities in the mode of the Hebrew Bible prophets. And so in some of these early meetings that Donald Trump had with religious leaders, starting in 2015, as he had just announced his run, this prophecy emerges, really pushed by some of these NAR leaders. And it's centered on the idea of Cyrus, right? The emperor of the Persians who sent the Jews back from exile.
I've seen a medal produced. I can send you a copy of.
Oh yeah, there's coins. I mean,
Trump, yeah, the coin,
yeah. But the reference they're using is Isaiah chapter 45, right, where the prophet Isaiah refers to Cyrus using messianic language. He's an anointed one. He's a Mashiach, right? Because he has played this role in God's plan for Israel. And the analogy they would use is conservative Christians in 2015 are in cultural exile in the US. And Donald Trump is not a good Christian. He might not even be a Christian, but he is anointed by God to send us back, to bring us back from exile, right? So they're using this messianic language, but framing him almost as a sort of a secular Messiah to deliver conservative Christians from exile. And that was one of the central rationales for why Christians, especially evangelical Christians, voted for Trump in 2016. That narrative, though, has evolved, and they've attached more and more of these prophecies and more of this messianic language to Trump, to where today they don't see him as an outsider. They see him as a devout Christian, and they have Christianized his, I guess we could call them values, his agenda. And so his approach to immigration, which I would argue runs completely opposite to the way that Jesus teaches us to think about outsiders, they have Christianized that and adopted that. And again, there's a lot of precedent in Christian history for baptizing unrepentant tyrants and then propagandizing them using theology. That this is not the first time this has happened in our history. It's just a particular acute instance of it because people are literally claiming that they have prophecies about him.
Mikhael, do you want to say something about, compare it to the situation in Israel and the support of the religious, very religious people in Bibi, who is definitely not a religious person per se, according to their definition, for sure?
First, I would mention that interestingly, Netanyahu also used a Cyrus analogy regarding Iran. So it's one that, and I'm sure even though he was talking ironically about, I think, himself and not about Trump, which would be easier theologically, I still think I imagine it's in conversation with this language which is happening. And in that sense, I think Netanyahu is sort of mythical figure in religious Zionists. Maybe I'll just add something which I imagine Matthew would agree that there's also part of it is the real belief, but part of it is also an understanding that here is an individual which can get us where we need to be, and there's always a way out. And I think a lot of times with these partnerships, that's what you hear. That's what you'll hear with the Israeli religious right regarding evangelical Christian Zionists. That I remember them saying, so far we're continuing to work together, even though our epilogues are different. So there is a mutual cynicism in these relationships of how you're being used. I think what you'll find is that over time, that cynicism subsides and actually new theologies emerge. So perhaps religious Zionism tended to be more skeptical of Netanyahu 10 years ago, and today they're much sort of deeper in this rabbit hole.
So thank you very much. I think we have to conclude the evening, but it's a very interesting conversation and many issues that were raised. We will have the recording on our website, and maybe I will put some links to articles and books that were written by Matthew and Mike and Mikhael. I would like to thank first of all, to the speakers, Dr. Matthew Taylor, and to Mikhael Manekin for your great work and research and very interesting conversation that we had. I would like to thank our colleagues at the Rossing Center, Ophir Yarden and Adi Marer. I invite you to follow us, the website, Facebook. We're gonna have crowdfunding in November if you want to support and see what we're doing. John Munayer, my colleague, and myself, we're going to be in the US in the end of October, around the East Coast. So if you want to meet us, you're welcome to contact us after Simchat Torah, after the 16th of October until the end of October, around New York, DC. So we'll be happy to see you there. And we invite you to join and to sign up for our newsletter so you'll be able to be updated with our coming webinars. I would like to conclude with the hope and the prayer that will come soon to at least ceasefire and then mediation and negotiation toward a just peace to everyone here in the Holy Land, in the Middle East, and we'll be able to talk about more positive things in the future, in the coming future. So we pray for peace, for just peace in our region and also in other places around the world. We need that desperately now. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you again, Matthew and Mikhael. It was fascinating, and I'm looking forward to hear more from you and read more from you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye. Good night.